Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast. It is just me this week, Matt Kirchner, not because we couldn't find a great guest for this week. In fact, it's amazing every single week that goes by how more and more we have people reaching out to us wanting to join the Tech Ed Podcast and be connected with our listeners in such an intimate way. So it's not that we didn't have a guest, it's that we have a topic so important that we wanted to cover it specifically for our listeners in STEM and technical education. It is going to be on the topic of tariffs, and it seems, of course, that nobody can talk of anything these days other than tariffs. Lots of things going on in U.S. trade policy. They are, whether we know it or not, going to have an impact on technical education and on STEM. We're going to cover in this episode the 5 ways that tariff policy is going to affect technical education and STEM and things that we need to be thinking about. We'll get into that in just a minute, but before we do, a couple of notes for you. First of all, obviously, tariff policy is moving around like crazy. In fact, every single day there's a new tariff, there's a new way of looking at tariffs, there's changes in terms of what tariffs the United States is considering implementing. We are not pretending to know as of the day that we're recording this, and certainly not as of the day that you're listening to it, that everything has become stable and that we know exactly what is happening in U.S. tariff policy. Instead, we are talking in generalities. Let's look out over the course of the next 3, 6, 9 months, and no matter what happens in the world of tariff policy and in the world of trade policy, making sure that we're ready. In other words, we're going to do some scenario planning when it comes to tariffs. This is a concept I learned about a number of years ago. I used to be a member of a group called TEC, the executive committee, and that group would get together about once a month, and it was a group of chief executives, and in my particular group, there were tech groups at that time. It's now called Vistage, by the way, but at that time, tech groups all over the country. So it was a group of maybe 10 or a dozen of us. We would get together every single month, talk about challenges in our businesses, talk about things that we were seeing, and in the morning for those meetings, we would have what was called the resource specialist. We would have somebody join us and talk about some topic. It was like professional development for chief executives and people who owned and ran businesses. We had one speaker, I admit that I've long forgotten his name. This was an individual who talked about scenario planning, and his whole premise was, look, when we think about our businesses, it is impossible to predict the future. It's impossible for us to know what is going to happen in the future. So trying to make a prediction and build an entire strategy around that prediction, that is not a particularly good idea. The odds that we can predict the future with any kind of precision, obviously very low. He said instead what we need to do is think about scenarios. What could happen? Come up with 3 or 4 different scenarios of what could happen, and then have a strategy or plan for if that scenario presents itself, what would we do? And then when the scenario does present itself, regardless of which scenario becomes true, we're ready to go with the strategy. That's what we're talking about here. Nobody knows what is going to happen with U.S. trade policy, right? And in 6 months, are we going to have huge tariffs on China and nobody else? Will we be getting closer to a fair trade where we've got, tariffs in place? They're similar between countries, and so we've got tariffs, but they're similar, and so there isn't necessarily an advantage one way or the other. Will we be more protectionist? Will we even be moving toward isolationism? I don't pretend to know. I think some of those scenarios are more likely than others, but the point of this is we are doing scenario planning. It's what Jamie Dimon, who as many of us know is the chairman and the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the most well-known and respected experts when it comes to economics, when it comes to finance, when it comes to banking, and when it comes to policy around those particular topics. What he said last week, I read this, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, but I'm not sure. He said, we continue to believe that it's prudent to maintain excess capital and ample liquidity in this environment. That's fine. If you're not a finance person, maybe that doesn't mean much to you. But listen to the rest of this comment. He said, as always, we hope for the best, but prepare the firm for a wide range of scenarios. That's what we're talking about here. What is going to happen in U.S. trade policy? How is it going to affect technical education? None of us know for sure. Let's think and talk about some scenarios so that we are ready when the scenarios present themselves. Okay, so over the course of this episode, I want to dispel a couple of viewpoints on tariffs. The first one, and we're hearing some of these things where people are like, you know what, everything is fine. Why are we even talking about trade policy? Why are we even talking about putting tariffs in place on other countries? My 401k was okay. My salary was good. Inflation's been a little crazy, but that seemed to be settling down. And now we're introducing all of this craziness. Well, let's talk about whether it's crazy for us to be addressing things like the U.S. trade deficit and some of the other challenges that we're facing in the U.S. economy. Now, I'll start this by saying we may or may not like the way the current administration goes about certain things. So it's not a comment on whether the tactics we're employing are perfect. Not here to comment on that one way or the other, but let's think for a moment about the condition of the U.S. economy. And I want to do this, as we do so often here on the Tech Ed podcast, by suggesting an analogy. And let's say that you, or maybe if you're a little further along in life, that we're talking about one of your children or somebody else that you care about. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else. Let's say an individual has an annual income of $60,000 a year. And let's say that same person is spending $80,000 a year. So earning $60,000, spending $80,000, not too hard to figure out where the challenges might come in there. And in fact, let's add another challenge. Let's say that this particular person owes the credit card companies $360,000, right? So we've got somebody making $60,000, spending $80,000, and they owe their credit card company $360,000. It doesn't take us very long to realize that is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. That is somebody who's in a big hole, and they're digging the hole and getting deeper and deeper into the hole. Well, the reason I bring that analogy up is let's talk for a moment about the United States budget and our national debt. So right now, we're in exactly that same situation. You just have to add a few zeros to the number. So as of today, rough numbers, the United States federal government takes in about $6 trillion with a T, $6 trillion a year. It is spending $8 trillion a year, and it is $36 trillion in debt. So that is that analogy that we talked about, the person making $60,000, spending $80,000 and $360,000 in debt. Add a few zeros, and that is the situation that the United States is in. We're spending $2 trillion a year more at the federal level than we're taking in, and we owe our debtors, we owe our lenders $36 trillion. That's a really, really scary situation. So the idea that we shouldn't be addressing some of these challenges, I think the reality is that we just have to address them. And the truth of the matter is that as time goes on, those problems are going to get even more acute as our baby boomers continue to age out of the workforce, expect to be paid what they paid into Social Security, and fewer and fewer people now in a position to be able to pay into Social Security, and for that matter, Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, we've got some really, really scary situations on the horizon, and I don't want to make light of that, and I don't want us to forget about that. By the way, in that analogy of the U.S. government, yes, I recognize there are some differences, that the federal government can borrow money a lot less expensively than we can on our credit cards. I also recognize that the federal government has the ability to print money, which none of us can do. If I owe somebody a bunch of money, I can't just print dollars to make that up. Of course, the federal government can. That comes with all kinds of other challenges, including inflation and so on. We won't get into all that. But the point of the matter is that we've got some fundamental challenges in our economy with our trade deficit, with our annual budget deficit, and with our national debt that need to be addressed, or the problems are going to get worse, not better. So point is, just because things might seem okay to a person now doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing all of these problems. And that is not to necessarily one way or the other endorse how we're going about it, other than to recognize on the onset that we've got to make some fundamental changes in our economy, or we're going to be in some big trouble here 5, 10, 15 years from now. Okay, so with that as the understanding, and the understanding that we're not going to opine one way or the other on the individual policies with regard to tariffs, amounts, percentages on one country versus another country, we've got to be preparing for a bunch of different scenarios as we fix some of these fundamental defects in our economy. So let's talk now, for those of you in STEM and technical education, what are those 5 things that we need to be thinking about? What are those scenarios that we need to plan for? And what are the things that, because of U.S. tariff policy and the likelihood that we are going to have significant tariffs in place going forward on imports to the United States, what does that mean for people in STEM and tech ed? Let's start with this. We talk about this all the time on the Tech Ed podcast. Manufacturing is coming back to America, right? It's coming back. It was coming back already in the wake of COVID. As we've talked about here, when we could get what we wanted, when we wanted it, at a price that seemed fair. Pretty much anything on Amazon or anywhere else, you just order it, it shows up at your door, and the price seemed fair. That was pre-COVID. Kind of easy to take manufacturing for granted. And then when all of that changed, when all of a sudden we couldn't get things at the price we wanted to pay, or for that matter, when we wanted them, everybody started to understand the value of supply chain. In fact, that became part of the normal parlance for Americans talking about challenges in the economy. So everybody all of a sudden is familiar with challenges related to supply chain and understands the importance of having domestic manufacturing. Well, as that manufacturing was coming back to America, that's just going to be exacerbated here in the age of additional tariffs, right? So if we're placing tariffs on products coming into the U.S., that makes them more expensive when they get here. That creates an incentive for us to make more investments in domestic manufacturing, because products manufactured here in the country are not going to be subject to those same tariffs. So we had this trend toward more manufacturing in the United States before we even started talking about tariff policy, and now tariffs are going to make that challenge that much more acute, and the likelihood that we will have more and more manufacturing being reshored to the United States that much more likely. Well, as we all know, we already in the current state don't have enough people working in American manufacturing, right? According to this study now that everybody's been quoting from Deloitte, that's been kind of the study of the day for the last 6 months. I see it at every conference, every skills gap and workforce conference that I go to. Every speaker brings up the Deloitte study that shows that we have 3.8 million people that are going to leave the manufacturing workforce over the course of the next 10 years, and only 1.9 people coming in, leaving another 1.9 jobs that will be open in American manufacturing. So we already have that problem before we start talking about the fact that tariffs are going to bring more manufacturing in the United States, creating even greater demand for manufacturing labor. It doesn't take too long for us to figure out what that is going to mean for technical education. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to spell one more viewpoint, and it's related to manufacturing, and I've seen it several times over the last couple of weeks as we're talking about tariffs. So over the last couple of weeks, we've seen tons of people suggesting, and this just makes me sick to my stomach, suggesting that Americans are, quote, too good for manufacturing jobs, that we won't want to have people working in manufacturing. In fact, there's this AI-generated video. By now, many of you have seen it. If not, you can certainly jump on a search engine and find it without too much trouble. An AI-generated video went viral a couple weeks ago, and it was mocking America and mocking overweight Americans basically working in manufacturing plants. It showed them, for example, overweight people sitting in what looked like a sweatshop at a sewing machine. And the joke was, oh, haha, isn't this hilarious? You know, like all of these 50-something-year-old American people are going to want to go work in jobs in manufacturing, are going to want to work in a sweatshop. Obviously, those of us that spend time in advanced manufacturing know that that is nothing about what manufacturing looks like. Manufacturing looks nothing like a sweatshop, at least in the vast majority of manufacturing facilities around the United States. But let's take this whole conversation one step further into an editorial that I read last week. And in that editorial, an author suggested that bringing more manufacturing jobs back to America was ill-advised because, and I'm going to do my best to quote it, and I'll tell you why. I don't have the exact quote in just a moment, but it was, we're ill-advised to bring manufacturing back to America because American parents don't want their kids working in dirty steel mills. That's literally what this editorial said. Now, I looked all weekend before recording this to find that editorial, and I couldn't find it. And I don't know exactly why. I think it was either in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's where I read it. But it made my blood boil. And this author basically saying that manufacturing jobs are, it goes back to the old dark, dirty, and dangerous. And why would we want to bring more manufacturing back to the United States to just put our kids to work in dirty steel mills? So, first of all, if anybody remembers who wrote that, if you saw that, and you remember who the author was, please, and you can do this, by the way, for any episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, go into the show notes, page all the way down to the bottom. You'll see a link down there that allows you to basically text right into the studio. And of course, we're obviously recording this podcast in advance, but we get that information directly for any episode. So anytime you're listening, you want to comment, you want to ask a question, you want to share some information with us, that's how you do it. Bottom of the show notes, click on the link. You'll send a text right to the podcast studio. But the point is, if you know who that author was, if you read that, let me know, because I want to track that person down. And when we do track that person down, by the way, open invitation to, and I'll just use the words, totally uninformed individual, condescending elitist, to come spend a day here in the Midwest visiting technology-driven, automated, data-centric manufacturing companies. We would love to show you what manufacturing actually looks like. Because if your paradigm is that advanced manufacturing facilities are like working in a sweatshop or working in a dirty old steel mill, and you are shaming parents for wanting or for even considering that their kids would want to work in that environment, shame on you, because the truth of the matter is that manufacturing is an amazing place to spend your career, and we need more people in manufacturing. The fact that we've got these changes in trade policy even makes that more important, because manufacturing will continue to come back to the United States. So whether you're that person who made the AI video of obese Americans working in sweatshops, or the author who said we can't bring manufacturing back because nobody's going to want to work there. And by the way, I just guarantee neither of them have ever been inside a modern, automated, data-backed advanced manufacturing plant in their entire life, and we would love to show them around one. Their minds will be changed. There's no question in my mind. So, technical educators, number one, be ready for the onslaught of manufacturing and manufacturers asking for manufacturing talent. Your employers, your local community employers, are going to be begging for more manufacturing talent. We'll get into why that's important for economic development in just a moment, but expect that to happen as we continue to implement tariffs, whatever tariff policy ends up being here in the United States of America. But here's the other thing about manufacturing, is that it is not coming back the way that it left. I spent time, as we all know, running manufacturing companies. I lived through the manufacturing exodus that happened in the late 90s and early zeros, as manufacturing and, frankly, the jobs that went along with it went to places like China. A lot of it went to Mexico. A lot of it went to Canada. Certainly, I'm not here to disparage our great North American trading partners whatsoever, but the truth is I lived through all of that manufacturing work and those jobs leaving the United States and going to other parts of the country. And there were other places as well. The Dominican Republic was another one, certainly all over Asia and so on. I lived through that. I remember what it was like. And now those jobs are starting to come back, and I think it's really exciting, but they are not coming back the way that they left. They are way, way, way more automated. There's a slide that I put up when I'm speaking to groups on whether it's artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing technology, Industry 4.0, workforce development, any of these topics. And it shows the number of robots being deployed in various countries around the globe. And it shows the countries that are most prolifically deploying automation. In other words, who is implementing and installing the most robots. And as an example, Japan, as of the date of this data, was deploying about 50,000 robots a year in manufacturing. The U.S., by the way, not too far behind Japan. Our number was 40,000 robots a year. Korea, 32,000 robots a year, and so on. And so you think, Japan at 50,000 robots, the U.S. at 40,000. And I hold out to the end and I say, I ask the audience, what country is missing from the slide? And almost every time somebody says the right answer. In fact, I think pretty much every time somebody says the right answer and they say, well, wait, where's China? And then I then I bring up the China number. And again, Japan, 50,000 robots a year, US, 40,000, China, 296,000 robots a year, more than 7 times the United States, and more robots being deployed in China than the rest of the world combined. Now, we talked earlier about the labor shortage in American manufacturing. China's got the same challenge. Their birth rates have been steadily dropping now for more than 40 years. They had their one-child policy in place from the late 1970s until about 10 years ago. By 2023, so now 2 years ago, the country recorded 9 million births in the entire country of China and 11.1 million deaths, right? So they had a natural population decline just in that 1 year of 2 million people. And that problem for China is not getting any better anytime soon. So they have an aging workforce, they have an aging population, they have the same challenge that we have here in the United States, although probably even more acute, with huge, huge numbers of people aging out of the workforce and not enough people coming in. What are they doing about it to keep their manufacturing alive and productive? They're automating. That's where those 296,000 robots are coming. And in the same way, we're going to see the same thing happen here in the United States. And frankly, in the same way that America, 50 and 100 years ago, we needed students that understood woods and we understood metals. That's kind of the old, quote, shop class that drives me crazy when people call tech ed shop class today. But that's what we were teaching. In the same way that we needed people familiar with woods and metals 50 and 100 years ago, we need people who are familiar with industrial robot technology, automation technology, robot programming and operation, smart systems, devices, sensors. In short, less woods, more robots. We need more students studying robotics and automation. That's where the jobs are going to be as manufacturing comes back to the United States. It's going to come back way more automated. Don't think for a minute that we can teach the same disciplines we were teaching in shop class 50 years ago, 75 years ago, and prepare a workforce for how highly automated and data-driven the world of manufacturing is getting. So that's number 2, is the work is coming back way more automated. Number 1, we have to plan for the fact that manufacturing is coming back to the United States. That is going to make our workforce challenges even more acute. Number 2, it's coming back way more automated. So we need to make sure that that workforce, as we are producing those workers, understands automation and advanced manufacturing technology. Number 3, it's coming back way, way, way more artificial intelligence backed. It's way, way, way more backed by AI. I read a lot on AI. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence here on the Tech Ed podcast. And right now we're reading a book. I would actually recommend it. It's a phenomenal book. It's called Genesis, and its author is Henry Kissinger, among a couple other people we'll note in a moment. Henry Kissinger, I think he was 100 years old. They actually published this book posthumously. He was a great American diplomat, great Secretary of State for the United States government, very, very well-known and well-respected expert on foreign policy, global affairs, and so on. Wrote a book on artificial intelligence. He was keenly interested in this all the way to his 100th birthday. The second author, by the way, is Eric Schmidt. If that name doesn't ring a bell, he is the former CEO and chairman of a little company called Google. Thereafter, he was the executive chair of Google. And then the third author is Craig Mundy, and he is the chief research and strategy officer for Microsoft. So these people, pretty sharp people, intelligent people, they understand the world, they understand technology. They wrote this book called Genesis, and I want to share, just a bunch of really good nuggets in that book and a bunch of eye-openers. But get this one, and I call it 4 years, 4 days, and 120 million times. So what we mean by that is just to put AI and the power of artificial intelligence into perspective. We can train an AI LLM, a generative AI model, to learn everything that you learned in 4 years of high school, and AI can learn all of that in 4 days. Think about that for a minute. Everything you learned in 4 years of high school, AI can learn in 4 days. And it's actually quite a bit less than 4 days, but it sounds better if you say 4 years into 4 days. So that's all it takes to train a large language model on everything that one of us learned in high school. But then once it's been trained on that, it can process information. Guess how many more times faster than the human brain? AI can process information 120 million times faster than a human can. So it can learn everything you learned in high school in 4 days and then process that information 120 million times faster than you can. This is one of the many reasons, and as we start to look into the future of artificial intelligence, machine learning, general artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence, the idea where AI becomes as smart as a human, and then super intelligence, which some believe and argue isn't too much further behind that, where AI is actually smarter than people, and all kinds of really, really interesting and in some cases kind of scary thoughts and permutations that come with that. They cover some of that in the book Genesis. But the point is, artificial intelligence totally changing every single aspect of our economy, not just manufacturing, every single aspect of our economy. And so technical education, STEM, I mean, this is moving so fast, we have to expose our students to this. We have to expose, and we've talked about it many times on the Tech Ed podcast, our students to the edge to cloud continuum, the idea that smart sensors and devices on the edge, gathering and acquiring data, sending that information to control systems, then up through computer networks, through ISPs, through Wi-Fi, and to cloud computing data centers, where all that data is processed. This edge to cloud continuum, changing everything about manufacturing, changing everything about our entire economy. Doesn't matter what sector you're in. It's changing defense, it's changing energy, it's changing healthcare, it's changing hospitality, it's changing retail. The list goes on and on and on. Whatever economic sector you're in, it is being transformed by artificial intelligence. And so number 3, manufacturing, as it comes back due to tariff policy, at least due in part to tariff policy, is going to be way, way, way more driven by artificial intelligence. So let's kind of tie those first 3 together really quick. Manufacturers coming back to America. It's coming back way more automated, and it's going to be coming back way more AI driven. And as we think in STEM and tech ed, regardless of level, K-12, technical college, community college, workforce training programs, universities, at every level, we've got to make sure that we're implementing automation and we're implementing artificial intelligence, the impacts of AI, and working with AI into our programming for our students so that they're prepared for those jobs as they come back to the great United States of America. All right, 2 more to go. So those were our first 3, manufacturing, automation, artificial intelligence. When we think about funding, the last 2 really kind of deal with the economic side, the financial side of technical education. Let's start first with the idea of acquiring, purchasing, curriculum, e-learning, hands-on training equipment, that stuff, particularly the equipment that we use in technical education, it's going to get more expensive in the short term. And as we're thinking about how we're budgeting for our programs, whatever you have budgeted, I'll just tell you, add 10% to whatever you're budgeting for your spend on specific equipment. I think the audience knows I'm involved in a bunch of companies. I'm on the boards of manufacturing companies. I'm on the board of a private equity fund. I invest in private equity, I invest in venture capital. And because of that, we follow a lot of manufacturing and a lot of technology companies. And I'm super involved in a number of companies in the ed tech space, right in the technical education space. So we're planning for the effect in all of those businesses of tariffs. It's scenario planning like we talked about before. We don't know exactly what the landscape is going to look like. We think there are several possibilities, some more likely than others. Regardless of what happens, we want to make sure we're ready so that we're not getting caught flat-footed. As we see the world changing, we're changing along with it. So we're planning for the effect of tariffs, and we're encouraging all those companies to do scenario planning in the same way that technical education should be doing scenario planning. So think about this, and we're thinking about it in our ed tech companies for that matter. How much of their spend is on products from Mexico, and how much is on products from Canada? And what if tariffs on the European Union are X, or what if tariffs on products from China are Y? Let's do all of that scenario planning. And I can tell you that suppliers of education technology equipment are doing exactly the same thing. They're doing it across the market, whether they're selling machine tools, machining centers, machine controls, robots, welding equipment, advanced manufacturing training equipment, technology experiences for the classroom. All of these things, almost all of it has some foreign component in it in terms of componentry, and some of it is flat out manufactured, a lot of it flat out manufactured overseas and coming into the United States. All of it subject to tariffs, assuming those tariffs are in place with the countries from which those products are being shipped. So my guess is, at least in our businesses that we're involved in, on average 10, maybe even 15% increase in pricing, even if they don't have a significant cost component from China. But the truth is that we don't know. We just need to be prepared for price increases. And if you're working, if you're budgeting, if you're planning for expansions to your program this year and your supplier hasn't increased your prices yet, now might, first of all, be a great time for you to order because those price increases are coming. And if you're thinking about your budgeting for the coming 12 months, just expect to see adjustments in pricing for technical education equipment. It's coming. So that's number 4. Is your technical training equipment, while even more important than it ever was before, is also going to be a little bit more expensive. That doesn't mean that help is not on the way. I think we're going to see even more funding in STEM and tech ed here in the next 12 to 24 months, but it's going to look different in the same way that manufacturing came back to America looking different than it did when it left. The funding models are going to look different going forward. And I think anybody that's got their eye on federal policy at this point recognizes that there is an effort to push education out of the purview of the federal government and onto the states. And this isn't a political statement. You can think that's a good idea. You can think that's a bad idea. You could think, as I do, that there's probably benefits and disadvantages that come both ways. But the truth is that we're going to see, we just see the changes in federal policy pushing education and responsibilities for education to the individual states. So this happens at a time that we've mentioned now probably 10 times in this podcast where manufacturing is going to be coming back to the United States. We are going to be building more manufacturing infrastructure in the United States. Individual states and regions are going to compete for those manufacturing plants. We've seen this already, right? I mean, people, whether we're competing for data centers, whether we're competing for manufacturing that's come back as a result of the CHIPS and Science Act and other federal policy, and a need here in the United States to have our own sources, domestic sources of really, really important semiconductor technology. We've already seen that, states competing for manufacturing plants. Expect that to grow like crazy, right? As we're building more manufacturing facilities here in the United States, more advanced manufacturing facilities, expect states to be competing for those plants. Now, I can tell you as someone that ran manufacturing plants for a lot of years, that we used to, when we were looking at opening up a new manufacturing facility, we'd look at 3 things and in this order, right? The first one was proximity to our suppliers and to our customers or to whoever came next after our step of the supply chain. For obvious reasons, we're reducing transportation costs the closer we are, A, to the point of production, if we're bringing in materials, and then B, to the point of consumption so we don't have to ship those products all over the place. So we would look for, first, proximity to customers and proximity to suppliers. Second, we would look to economic incentives that were coming from state and local governments. And were they willing to offer tax breaks or offer TIF districts or other funding mechanisms that enabled us to build a plant or expand a plant in a specific geographical area? Third thing, and it was at the time, it was probably a distant third, was workforce, right? We could find people in that day and age. It was not a high priority. If we built a new plant, we would find the people. Today, that is completely flipped. And I can tell you that the number one topic that we're looking for when we're expanding into a new geographic territory in manufacturing is the proximity to workforce, and particularly that proximity to a skilled workforce and to workforce training programs. One of the many, I'm such a huge advocate for technical colleges and community colleges. They play such an important role in this. But suffice it to say that as manufacturing is coming back and states are competing for manufacturing facilities, because manufacturing facilities grow a region, because manufacturing facilities along with them bring a tax base, you're going to see a lot of competition. Well, guess what? As employers are considering where they're going to put those plants, what is going to be top of mind for them? Access to workforce talent. And therefore, we are not going to be able to attract manufacturers to individual states unless we have a robust workforce training program in place to make it worth their while to locate in that state. So now you've got these things, all these things that are happening. You've got, number one, manufacturers looking for talent. Number two, more manufacturing coming back to the United States. Number three, the funding models for education probably moving less from the federal government and then to become the responsibility of the states, and states needing to have those workforce training programs in order to attract manufacturing. It's pretty obvious what's going to happen. The states that are successful in continuing to create a workforce, and when I say a workforce, a skilled workforce in manufacturing that understands automation, that understands manufacturing technology, that understands artificial intelligence and data in manufacturing, the states that figure out how to create that workforce are going to attract those manufacturers. And for that matter, you're going to see a lot of state funding coming into technical and STEM education in the next 2 to 4 years as states figure out how they can promote building a talented workforce and increasing the amount of labor that's available to these advanced manufacturing companies as they're coming back to the United States. So what is going to happen is the educators that can prove that they've got great programs and that can prove that they will prepare this next generation of the workforce, that they are going to get that funding. And so technical education, STEM education needs to be thinking about how we create and build upon the programs that we already have to make sure that we can continue to produce the level of talent that manufacturers are going to need, that states are going to fund as manufacturing comes back to the United States of America in this age of tariffs. So, wow, we covered a lot in this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. Let's tie this all together. Tariff policy. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we have to plan for a variety of scenarios. I think what we do know is that in the wake of increased tariffs on imports, we're going to have even one more incentive for manufacturing to make its way back to the United States. But we don't have enough people to afford to and to be able to accommodate all this manufacturing, so we need to automate. That is number 2. Number 3, it is going to come back way more data-driven. It is going to come back way more AI-driven. You already know this if you listen to the Tech Ed Podcast every week. We need to prepare our students for the edge-to-cloud continuum and make sure that they understand how we're taking information from the edge, sending it up to the cloud, analyzing it, predicting the future, using that data to improve efficiency and productivity in manufacturing. So we have to, if we haven't already, prepare our programs for a focus on automation, a focus on advanced manufacturing, and a focus on artificial intelligence. The next thing is, as manufacturers are coming back to the United States, they are going to be looking for those states that have a focus on workforce that can give manufacturers an assurance that they will be able to produce this next level and this next generation of advanced manufacturing talent. Expect states to be funding technical education because we need to create that next generation of STEM and workforce talent, which of course is what we are all about here on the Tech Ed Podcast. So tariff policy, more manufacturing, more automation, more artificial intelligence, a greater need for workforce, and expect funding models to move to states and funding to grow for those STEM and technical educators who get it and recognize that we're not funding students on how to work around woods and to run woods programs and metals programs. We're preparing students to work in the age of advanced manufacturing, which looks way, way, way different. Trade policy is going to have us on a wild ride for some time. Do your scenario planning and be ready when things change. By the way, we'll have a ton of content here on the Tech Ed Podcast to help along the way. Be sure to tune in along the way. In the coming weeks and months, we will be talking more and more about U.S. trade policy, its impact on manufacturing, and its impact on STEM and technical education. Looking forward to spending that time with you. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. Of course, we talked about a couple things over the course of this episode, including how you can text directly into the studio here at the Tech Ed Podcast. You'll find all of that in the show notes. Let's put those at techedpodcast.com/tariff. That's techedpodcast.com/TARIFF. You will find all of that information there. And check us out on social. And as things are taking place in technical education, of course, the Tech Ed Podcast, your source for keeping up with everything Tech Ed and STEM. Find us on social media. Of course, Facebook. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on TikTok. You can find us on LinkedIn. Wherever you go to consume your social media, we will be there for you. Thanks again for being with us on this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. See you next week.